Um, Thank you for joining us. I'm Nadira Tudor and I'm delighted to be your host and moderator today. This session is actually, because we're such a short session, I don't think any of you would object to some questions from the audience, because there aren't that many people. If any of you want to move forward, please do, if you want to be closer to the stage. Otherwise, I'm sure you're very comfortable. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panel today, and my first guest is Mike Appleby. Welcome. Rory Alexander is here from M&G Investments. I forgot to say Mike's from Liontrust. Julia Dreblow, SRI Services Limited, and Gabriela Herculano, iClima Earth. I hope I've said that okay.
You did.
Welcome, all of you. And I think just to kick off the session, it'd be a really good idea for all of you to kind of introduce yourselves, what you do, and your initial thoughts on this very big subject, solving the climate crisis from an investor's perspective.
Sure, I'll start because I'm at the end. I'm hoping the mic is on. Can you hear me? Is that hoping? Cool. Okay, so I'm Julia Dreblow. I run my own business, which is called SRI Services. The main part of that is a free-to-use database intended for financial advisors, but paid for by fund management partners, two of whom are on the stage with me today, so Liontrust and M&G, very much key partners who help us do what we do for free. And I also do consultancy and bits to try and help people move things along in the right direction in this area. But I've also been a member of the Disclosure Enables Advisory Group for the FCA, so I've been working with them for some time and on the new SDR paper that came out 2 days ago. So I've specialised in the area, first got involved in 91, full-time since 96-ish. So I've been in this space for a long time, seen all the various changes that have gone on. My key thoughts on this, I'm hoping that no one else is planning to say exactly the same thing. The first thing you've got to recognise is that climate change is relevant to absolutely everything that we do. Some people like to talk about it affecting various sectors. Well, it doesn't. It's going to affect everything. It's going to affect the way we lead our lives. So it's massively important. It's an existential threat. And in terms of what investors need to do, two main things. We've got to finance solutions, so we've got to drive money into companies that are doing things differently and that are actually going to help us solve the problems by creating the technologies that we need. And alongside that, and equally important but often very low profile, is we've got to force existing companies to transition or encourage existing companies that are damaging the planet to transition. I'm sure we'll talk about that quite a lot on the panel here. So they're my two main things, I would say.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike Appleby. I work at Liontrust on the team that run the Sustainable Future Funds, and in terms of investors' role, yes, it's an important role, and one is where you're allocating capital to, and whether those companies are going to thrive or wither in the shift towards an ultra-low economy, and what the quality of the conversation you're having with companies, and it's really about the pace of change that you are agitating for with the companies. Those are the two areas that investors can have an influence on this, I think.
Rory.
So Rory Alexander, I work at M&G. I run the UK Sustained Paris Aligned Fund. So it's about £550 million that we invest in high quality sustainable growth businesses, so exposed to sustainable thematics and where the company understands ESG and in particular net zero and their own pathway to net zero. So the fund's changed to be Article 9 SFDR equivalent, Paris aligned in July, and having heard Gabby's presentation a minute ago, I'm sure I'm going to take quite a lot of fire from her as to the theory underpinning Paris alignment, but we try to invest in exceptional environmental companies that not necessarily purely solution providers, but companies that have a genuine strategy to decarbonise, and that decarbonisation runs through the genes and the fabrics of the business. And us as investors can engage with the business to try and accelerate and enforce that and push it as much as possible. And we do an awful lot of that these days with the companies we invest in.
Thank you, Rory. Gabriela.
Fantastic. Yes, delighted to be here. My name is Gabriela. Everybody calls me Gabi. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a London-based green fintech called iClima Earth. We are 3 years old. And our reason for being was to bring to market a shift in narrative where we would tell the decarbonization story in a fundamentally different way. And I'm going to get to why capital markets can and should be a source of good, and it has completely ties to the different investment strategies. We think that most of the industry was telling the story of decarbonization as the less harm story, companies where decarbonization is a cost line item. Companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon that are usually the usual suspects and largest constituents of the funds that are deemed to be Paris aligned. We wanted to shift the narrative and very much focus on companies where decarbonization is a revenue line item. What they do, the products and services they bring to market preclude emissions from ever taking place in a very material way. So that's a shift in narrative. That requires the use of a different metric. So it's not about using different black box ESG scorecards that use numbers that look backwards on how companies have reduced their footprint, which good corporate citizens must and are doing that. But it's about using a tangible metric that is forward-looking, that allows us to estimate the impact of the different solutions. And there are a lot of things that we can do with that data. We can get to that in more detail later on. So how does that tie to the role of investors in this beautiful sustainable future that we want to bring to reality? Well, there are 3 paths to net zero, and once we start investing and be more precise on how we go about doing that, all those goals and all those the ways to measure causation, not correlation, will become more and more relevant. So there are 3 paths to net zero. One is that path that we represent. It's the path of innovation, the products and services that preclude emissions from ever taking place. I think we're all agreeing that the best way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere is by not emitting in the first place. So we can have very satisfying lives, go from point A to point B with driving a Tesla, much lower emission than if you go from point A to point B with an internal combustion engine. We can eat a delicious Beyond Meat burger, plant-based solution, as opposed to a beef burger and all the emissions that come associated with that. So that path of innovation is, we can quantify the relevance, we have done that, is the most important path to net zero. But it's not the only path, and the problem is so big that we have to have different parallel paths. The second path is nature. Sequestering from the atmosphere, the only proven technology that we have for that are trees. Nature as an asset class is something that we're working on. We have not cracked the code, but is going to happen. We don't have an economic model for that just yet. Carbon offsetting in the voluntary market may be the very first building block. And here, again, we come with the relevance of investors. Investors will flow once that economic model is clear, and when the returns, you can quantify it, you can estimate, and you understand the risks. And that third path is the path of less harm. Less flaring, less emissions when you produce cement. The things that we produce obscene amount of, steel, cement, fertilizers, they all have a very strong tie to fossil fuel. So that path of less harm. So once we start being much more precise with the different investment strategies, what risks they come with, and what metrics we can use to estimate that relevance and the impact, then invisible hand will work itself through, and markets will put a lot of capital towards the clear winners of the energy crisis, the clear winners of this current conundrum that we are. And once we start accelerating that energy transition, more and more capital will flow towards the very relevant solutions. So capital markets has been a source of good, and it can do so much more. And it forces all the data providers, all the participants, all the players to do better, to come up with more precise investment strategies and more precise definitions, so we don't keep using things interchangeably, which is still an issue in the industry. People refer to sustainability, ESG, impact, as if they work to mean the same thing, and they're not supposed to mean the same thing. So all of that, I think, is going to be, pushed and become reality because of capital markets. So it's a fundamental role.
Thank you for that. And Gabriela, you've probably answered the question that I'm going to ask all of you. And so many issues, don't you think, there? I'm a little bit cynical. I've actually moderated many of these discussions on sustainability. And I want to take your point that you started off saying, which was that everybody cannot avoid the impact of climate now. It's very loud. I hope you can all hear me. And companies have to make changes. But adoption is something that we're not seeing across the board, is it? So how can we ever solve this climate crisis that we're discussing, the broader discussion that we're talking about today, from that investor's perspective? How can we ever do it realistically? I keep coming back to this. Are we ever going to get to net zero?
Sure, just a thought. Is there any chance someone might nip next door and ask them to turn that down if anyone's sitting over this side and feels able to ask them? Oh no, there you go. So you talked, Gabriela, about invisible hand. Yes, certainly my generation, we're brought up believing that's a big chunk of the answer, and to a large extent it is. But I think, not having heard the exact words of what you said, but I think what we've got to recognise now is that we do need governments and regulators to step in. Certainly in the early days when I was first involved in this, it was all about consumer choice and we'd make the right decisions, and the financial case was so blatantly obvious that why on earth would you need regulation? That all changed in 2015 with the Paris Climate Agreement. People suddenly went, oh, actually, governments have signed up to this, I'm going to take it seriously. And the roll forward that we've seen of all these different bits of regulation across different countries, and the fallout we see when it looks like it's not going to happen, the upset about fracking the other day with Liz Truss, and obviously the Trump effect in the US, it tells us that we really do want and need regulation, and we need some, what the FCA are calling now, guardrails to drive people in the right general direction. And there's multiple examples. I mean, I know about the SDR, I don't know all regulation everywhere, but
well, that's the point, though, isn't it?
That's part of it, though.
Isn't part of the problem that the bitty regulation that different governments are implementing onto companies across the globe, and will they ever be aligned? If you've mentioned policy and governments, and that has to be in place. But
I think
how is that going to be solved?
Yeah, we can't pretend that all countries are the same.
Mark, have you got a view on
guy
this as well?
Spoke out very loudly at the conference I ran, my conference a couple of weeks ago, saying, did we know what was going on in the supply chains? And then he was clearly a lot more worried about that than he was climate change. And he was talking about the situation in India. We can't pretend we're all starting from the same point. We're not. The massive per capita emissions are coming from countries like our own and the US and Canada. And there may be people here who can trot off stats on that way better than I can, but we've got to recognise that we're in different places. So the important thing is that the direction of travel is clear, and I think most of us are moving in the same general direction, and that those of us that have been responsible for so much of the emissions and are so much wealthier should rightly be expected to move faster than other countries. We're in a better position to do so. Yes, we've been in a mess recently, but relative to other countries, we're really well placed to lead because we're a wealthy country. So regulation, legislation, etc. But don't try and make it uniform. There's the ISSB that we'll probably come on to in a bit. But generally, we've got to recognise we have our differences.
Mark, we
It's
obviously
Mike, but
have.
that's
I know,
fine.
but I just want to hear, from the experts. I'm sure everybody else wants to hear as well.
Yeah, no. So
it's a dilemma. It's a very real dilemma.
Yeah.
So it's not enough, is it, that one country puts all this legislation in place, and we can't even talk about the adoption of that legislation and the loopholes in it as well. What can we do?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a huge challenge to be able to decarbonise. No one's pretending that it's easy. And there is some international agreement on this, hence the Paris Agreement, trying to limit the amount the global average temperature is warming up. And there's some great initiatives and things going on with people committing to get to net zero. Unfortunately, if that's a very long time away when you've retired, That's quite easy to commit to. I'm being a bit of a cynic. We want to see how much actual carbon are you going to be able to reduce from your business by 2025, and critically, how are you going to do it? Because I think while the various initiatives to decarbonise are really helpful, you want companies to get involved in them, and they can help companies work out how to get there. You've got to be realistic that some companies aren't going to make it. Just as if you're investing in a company and they say they're going to double their margins by 2030, you need to understand how are they going to double their margins by 2030, and is that realistic, and do you believe that they're going to be doing it? And it's that same level of scrutiny is needed when you're thinking about climate targets, because I think that the temperature alignment tool, so what this does is it adds up all the companies in your portfolio and says on average, these companies, given what they've said they're going to do in terms of decarbonisation, the global average temperature rise from these companies is 1.9, so it's less than 2, so it's Paris aligned. I think that's useful, but at the same time, I think it can sometimes lead us to feel that we're getting a lot further than we really are, because if you look within, I'm not saying this is the same for all portfolios, but some of the methodologies in there can make some companies that are emitting more CO2 than the whole of the UK emits in a year. It makes them look a lot better than they really are compared to a much smaller company that's hardly got any CO2 to emit, but it hasn't committed to a target. So I think we've made a huge amount of progress, but we shouldn't trivialise this and think that, we're so far away from solving this climate crisis right now. I know Planet Tracker look at global regulations that you were alluding to, and even if we do all hit all the targets that we've currently committed to globally, the global average temperature rise is looking at somewhere between 3.5 to 4 degrees, which is a lot higher than 2 degrees. So I think we need to remain grounded in common sense as well while we're doing this, and not get overfaced by the hugeness of it, but be quite critical in assessing how successful a company is going to be in the future, because ultimately that is also going to affect their cash flows. So there are lots of reasons to understand this and be invested in companies that are going to be winners or not going to be the huge losers in this necessary transition that we all need to go through to stop trashing our economy through climate change, essentially, and the environment as well.
Rory, I want to hear your perspective on this. It's great that some countries are coming together and goals are being set, and the intentions are good, but there is the dilemma. What's your perspective on this?
I think we've got to be quite clear that we're going to fail absolutely spectacularly by 2030, and
that's
a
statement.
Well, I'll come on to various points just from a government perspective and from a corporate perspective, but I think the scope 1 and scope 2 of companies, so the energy they're buying in and their direct emissions, there is an ability for companies, and we can push them quite heavily on that to decarbonise, but it's things like buying PPAs from renewable companies, which is got its own issues. But I think a lot of corporates at the moment are coming out with net zero commitments, and they really don't understand how the supply chain and the scope 3 actually relates to their ability to decarbonise that. So, we promote all of our companies to get an SBTI, so Science-Based Target Initiative. That's a formalised net zero target. Now, on that, they have to essentially promise that they're going to cut scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 by 50% by 2030, and then 90% by 2050, and then they can use up to 10% offsets. I think it's very easy for management teams and corporates to promise that currently, and I think quite a lot of them don't understand actually how to achieve it. And I suppose that's our job, is filtering through the people that genuinely mean it and genuinely understand the strategic objectives necessary to decarbonise, where it's embedded in remuneration, it's embedded in governance structures, it runs through a business, so you can actually see a tangible pathway to net zero and also cutting 50% by 2030. I think I want to come back to your point on regulation. I still think regulation is lightweight. I know you fed into the SDR, but it's 178 pages long. It came out 2 days ago. It's a briefing paper on naming regulation, taxonomy from the FCA about the UK. And it's aimed to limit greenwashing. And I spent 2 hours looking through the 178 pages, and I think it's full of loopholes for funds and investment managers to jump out of or escape fully ESG and sort of Paris aligning their funds. The fact is, you can call yourself sustainable if 70% of your fund is sustainable. Well, what's the other 30% in? I think it's a bit of a cop-out, to be honest. But look.
Can I just say now, feed that back into them, because some of us might have
I
disagreed with that previously.
Very controversial.
No, I think in the UK, corporates are doing well. I think we're 25% of UK listed companies have an SBTI. I think from a regulatory perspective, we're behind the curve. In the EU, you've got Repower EU. That's a proper, proper subsidies, proper plan for decarbonising the European Union. In the US, you've got the Inflation Reduction Act. What is it? 460. Is it billion or trillion? Billion. I always get lost in them.
It's a big number. Yeah.
In I think it's a billion. Yeah. In proper money that's going to be sourced in or pushed towards decarbonisation. The problem is in the US, and we deal with US companies, I'm sure you do as well, is that you talk to them about SBTI, they've never even heard of it. They barely disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, let alone understand anything to do with Scope 3. In Europe, you're somewhere in between. You've got good regulatory framework, you've got good corporate understanding. Then everywhere else on Earth, there's very little government framework and very little corporate understanding. And that's just the listed equity sphere. What about private companies? We worry about the de-equitization of markets, companies leaving listed life to go and be private because it's easier. They don't have to disclose, they get paid more. They don't have to worry about shareholders 4 times a year coming knocking on their door saying, you're getting paid too much according to these people. What I would love to see is governments force private companies to step up to the level of public companies have to do. I think when you start getting concrete initiatives like that, then you can fully decarbonise. So and the last thing I want to do, which maybe we come onto later, but carbon taxes. I still think carbon taxation. You can dangle a million carrots out there, but at some point you just need a bloody big stick.
Yeah, Rory for Prime Minister. You might be there next week. Gabriela.
I'm a glass half full kind of person, and here's what I think changes everything. Love to hear Rory talking about Repower 55 and the IRA. I could not love the name more. Inflation reduction, and you're putting together the idea of solar panels and deflationary, and that's what I think is going to change everything. We've been doing a lot of research for the past 3 years on this energy crisis and the trilemma. A lot of analysts are talking about the trilemma. How do we decarbonize while we give guarantee of supply and affordability of energy? Energy is the big problem. It's the worst of times, it's the best of times, because we've never had the technologies that we have now, and the solutions, the seeds are all there. So let's be very specific about the numbers for the US and for Europe, and tell me if this doesn't change everything. We're talking in the US about 1,000 gigawatts of solar only being added to the grid by 2035. That is the most ambitious target by the Department of Energy in an analysis they did in the Solar Studies report published in September last year. That is when the US decarbonizes and electrifies. What? Solving the biggest problems and the biggest industries that we have: energy, transportation, and buildings. Okay, so 1,000 gigawatts. Well, the current installed capacity in the US is about 1,000 gigawatts, a bunch of coal still there, natural gas. Coal needs to be that top priority. We need to decommission all that coal, but how can we? Because winter is coming, right? So that's the conundrum we all understand. 1,000 gigawatts of installed capacity in the US, 1,000 gigawatts of solar to be built by 2035. Naysayers come and say, never gonna happen, this is too big of a number, it's not doable. Well, two things. First of all, solar is a technology, it's not a fuel. So unlike the fossil fuel guys that keep, with these volatile hydrocarbons that only get more and more expensive, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the deflationary curve that these two key technologies, solar and batteries, we've been spot on for the last 40 years. Every time we double production, capacity goes down, prices come down 20% for solar and 25% for batteries. Talk about being deflationary, huh? So 1,000 gigawatts of solar that will become, the more we produce, cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So the economic incentive to replace natural gas, expensive. Coal, expensive. Forget about the decarbonization for a second. It's just the right thing to do from an economic perspective. So it doesn't matter who is at the White House. It matters a great deal, Julia. I completely agree. But still, the economic incentive to replace that electricity is huge. So 1,000 gigawatts, naysayers come and say that's never going to happen. Well, Lawrence Lab come up with the analysis of what is currently, right now, 2021, so end of last year, in the pipeline in the US grid. There are 677 gigawatts of solar just waiting for grid connection. We all know, we understand project finance, it requires a lot of things to be in place. You have to have the EPC, you have to have the grid connection, you have to have the land, you have to have the financing, interest rates that are coming up. Yes, there's headwind. 677 gigawatts of solar waiting for grid connection in the US right now. Tell me we don't have a really good shot of bringing 1,000 gigawatts of solar to the US by 2035, which is the biggest wild dream of the Department of Energy. We do. Now let's cross the Atlantic, Repower 55. 600 gigawatts of solar to be added to the grid, new solar to be added to the grid across the European member states by 2030. Now, not only this is happening, but where it happens and how it happens changes everything. Ursula von der Leyen, that's her number, more than half of all this solar will be at the point of consumption. That's called distributed renewable energy, meaning solar rooftops. We are going to be adding a lot of capacity at the point of consumption. We are all, and these are the words of the European Union themselves, we're all going to become prosumers. 87 to 90% of all of us in the next 10 years, we will be prosumers. We will be producing part of our, not necessarily going 100% self-sufficient, but we're going to be producing a lot of the electricity, even in this country, from our solar rooftops. And we're embracing energy efficiency, smart meters, smart thermostats. Well, that's what the governments across Europe should be doing, just a parenthesis here, right? Don't just write a check to the consumers, make us all earn that check by forcing us to be energy efficient. Cut your consumption by 20% and then I'll help you pay your bill. It has been done. By the way, I grew up in Brazil. We did that in 2001 very successfully. It's an economic incentive. We have smart meters, smart thermostats. We have all these technologies, and your phone is the coolest thing. Manages all of that, including when is the right time for you to charge your car. And by the way, that car, that electric vehicle, it's all becoming bi-directional. So we can use that storage, clean energy storage ability inside the electric vehicles to the benefit of the grid. Octopus does exactly that. So the seeds of all of the key solutions that we really need to solve our biggest problems of how we move away from a fossil fuel based, dated, expensive grid that has a very high carbon footprint, all the solutions are in place. We are scaling up, and we could always have better policies, but with Repower 55, with the IRA, we are bringing the consumer center stage, and the consumer is saying, I want predictability of supply, I want to save money day one, and that's, guess what, Sunrun does just that. Call them and they come and they install this whole, the microinverters, the solar panels, the smart meters, the smart thermostats, the charging. Wallbox does that. It's a very cool solution to charge that car. So that future is here. That house of the future already exists. Some of us, some of my neighbors already have that. And that is a very, very important pathway for us to solve, finally, the decarbonization issue, and how we're going to have a chance of being at 2030 cutting emissions by half is the energy. And the energy crisis gives us that impetus and economic incentive to do so. So best of times, worst of times, and there's a lot of analysts that are misreading the signs and where we are. Yes, we have Ørsted, a very interesting company, a huge player in the wind space, leading on the offshore wind. They're being asked to keep their coal-fired power plants ready to be decommissioned, running, because winter is coming. What else are you going to do? So then, analysts project that our emissions are going to go like this, but at some point, sooner rather than later, 2024, 2035, we can debate this, passionately. It is going to tip, and we're going to be in that hopefully very steep downward slope. And we all know that energy is a very huge issue and cause of climate change and decarbonization. So I think the elements are all there. It is about the technologies. It is about scaling up all the relevant solutions. We have not even talked about heat pumps, which is a very big focus for Repower 55. Not easy to retrofit, but for new buildings, that's definitely a key solution. And they become more and more reproduced, and more, this is capitalism at its best. More players step in, more of your companies will be trying to bring to market yet another better way of replacing methane, and then we have all the economic incentive to do so, and we are, with IRA and Repower 55, bringing the consumer center stage. Europe is definitely leading, so all of the elements are there. We need to do more of certain things. We'd love to see a carbon tax. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't, but the economic stimulus to change the way we live our lives is very much here.
Gabriela, you're so optimistic. I'm going to bring in the cynic Mark back here.
Mike.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I'm still called Mike, but yeah.
Mike. So the seeds are still there, or all planted. How do we make those seeds grow if all the elements are there? Gabriela's talked about how she thinks, very optimistically, that every consumer is going to adopt this. I'm not bought on this, actually, Mike.
No, I agree with a lot that's been said. It's never has it made more sense to invest in energy efficiency or made more sense to install renewables. And for those, this awful thing that's been happening in Ukraine and the energy crisis that's come out of it has further strengthened an already incredibly strong case to displace fossil fuels, certainly in electricity generation with renewables, and it is super positive, and I think that's great. I think that just going back to as investors, that there are some companies that are involved in energy efficiency products, so insulation, smart lighting, smart HVAC. You walk into a room and when you're not there, the lights turn off, or you can make part of your house hot. There are all sorts of interesting things that you can do to stop wasting energy, and that's really critical. But not every company sells that kind of stuff or renewables. There are a lot of companies that get on with making whatever their widget is, and they've got a challenge whereby they've got to halve the amount of carbon that they emit to produce every widget that we use. And these might be really useful things like life-saving drugs or materials with which we're going to live in our house. And so I think while we've seen huge steps forward, and I'm really glad, I remember in 2004 people talking to me and I was saying renewables are going to be huge, and a lot of people were really cynical. I remember people talking to me in an incredibly patronising way and telling me that, Mike, I really hope that this future happens for you, but really the sensible thing is clearly extending our coal and nuclear plants, etc. And so it's really nice to see this as things scale up, things that seem impossibly expensive. Solar was subsidised by the German government for a decade. And thank you, Germany, because what they did is they were able to get a solar industry to double the amount of solar modules that they could make in a year, and each solar module per unit got cheaper and cheaper. And you've talked about these learning curves and stuff like that. So, and that is happening in lots of places. We're beginning to see that in batteries now, and you know, in these potential for fuel cells to be used to make hydrogen out of water, and all kinds of interesting stuff. But so I think that's super positive. But you know, as investors, unless you're only focused on a tiny part of the market, you've got to bear in mind, if I'm invested in this company, what is its strategy? Going back to what Rory was saying, you know, what is its strategy to keep doing whatever it's doing into the future? And as investors, you can encourage them on that journey. And there are lots of different places where you can sit on that, and there's no right answer. You can talk to an oil and gas company and ask them to become a renewables energy company. That's great. Some people, that's fine. I personally would rather spend my time doing other things and talking to other companies to do that. So, but as investors, I think going back to Julia's point, you know, for a long time it was thought that by not owning a coal mining company, you're done with the way you've positioned your investment. I think we're beginning to realise now that right the way across the economy, we've got to decarbonise, and there are some areas where it's going to be really tough. It is tough to reduce how much CO2 you emit per unit of concrete. It is tough to reduce how much CO2 you emit per unit of steel. Recycling that steel is 80% more efficient, so we're going to see more and more steel recycling. So if we can find companies that are part of that, taking waste out of valuable bits of waste out of waste streams and being able to reuse that, and in that process cutting emissions by 80%, these are the kind of numbers we need. That potentially could be a really interesting investment if it's well managed and it's profitable. Because a lot of the time in sustainable investment we talk about the sustainable bit, but it's also got to be a decent investment. So with solar, while that's been brilliant, investing in companies that make solar modules has not been a great investment, because the bit of kit they sell has got 8% cheaper each year for the last 30 years. So I'm just bringing in that bit that as investors, you've got to think about what's going on in the climate area and pick companies that are going to deliver goods, but also that have a credible way of trying to still function and do what they do in a world where by the end of this decade, you know, in 7 years' time or whatever it is, we're supposed to have halved emissions. I don't know if anyone in this room has tried to halve their emissions, but I'm working on it, and it's pretty tough.
Anyone?
Anyone? So, you know, this is the kind of thing we all if we're concerned about climate change, we need to think about, you know, what we do at work and what our business does, how can that do something, but also us as individuals, you know, what we consume, where we go, what we do. Is there anything that we can do? And there's some really low-hanging fruit that people can do, but, you know, we can't all just sit here and go, oh, it's a real shame that we're not going to be able to get to I really hope we get to net zero, without looking at what job you do, what product and service that provides, and what you can do within that business to make it less carbon intensive, and also in your own life, the choices that you make. And I'm not suggesting that you don't go anywhere and you live in a cave and you do nothing and you have a really miserable time, because that would be really dull. But I'm suggesting that you know, when it actually comes down to it, you know, we are actually going to have to do some things differently than how we do it, just smarter. It's not saying we don't put heating on in our house, but we just got to do it in a smarter way. It seems we've got lost on a tangent there. Anyway, I'll stop.
No, I don't think you have. And actually, I want to bring you in, Julia, because consequences is something, you know, you're talking about every individual taking responsibility, as well as the corporations and governments and all the rest of it. But let's look at the consequences if, for example, the UK companies don't reach the targets that they've set or follow the legislation or, you know, adopt these policies that they're meant to be doing? What are the consequences, Julia?
Okay, there's so many things that have been said. So consequences, maybe I'll come on to that slightly. So I think to position it, there's lots of different elements, and consequences, obviously the government can impose consequences and the markets can impose consequences. And I clearly would not have worked in sustainable investment if I didn't believe that the economic case was completely sound. And on a personal perspective, talking about reducing emissions in your house, I'd be really interested to know, how many people here have got solar panels?
One.
Yeah, smart meters? Heat pumps? Yeah, I mean, this stuff is exactly as you're saying. So, you know, we've got to find ways of getting this stuff to be, you know, everyone who cares about this can get it. And that's why I think, you know, partly why I think regulation has a role to play. I mean, we're looking at getting a heat pump done at the moment, fitted in our house, because we've got the solar panels, we've got the electric car, we've got the smart meter. And exactly as Mike's saying, the further you go down that route, the harder it becomes to reduce, because you've done all the insulation and the easy stuff. And the heat pumps, we're looking at kind of destroying our driveway to put them in, and so actually that's going to be expensive. And how do you live when you're doing that? But consequence-wise for businesses, I hope the markets will punish them, companies that don't do what they say they're going to do, because they need to believe that's what's going to happen. Because if they don't think shareholders care, then they've got no real incentive, because they'll have their LTIPs and all the rest of it as senior execs, and you know, if they think they can carry on and not, you know, be a bit fluffy about it, then I can't really see how the market mechanisms will work. What else? I mean, I like to think it comes down to consumers, but as we know from the show of hands here, I mean, I guess that people who are in this room now are all people that really care about this stuff, right? And for various reasons, I mean, financially, not least, you know, it's really expensive, so you can't put this all on consumers.
No.
You know, I like to think a good chunk of it you can. You know, I can make those decisions. I mean, goodness knows we've had our ups and downs with our finances over the years, but, you know, I'm strong-headed enough to say, I'm sorry, now's the time the solar's going on. But not everybody can do that, so we can't put it all on companies. So we've got to have all these different mechanisms all working together to pull people in the same direction, and to have people who are living in properties that can't possibly have their own solar panels. It's a block of flats, and simply that would never generate enough. So we've got to be a lot more creative with all these solutions, and use land more wisely as well. But yeah, so essentially I hope markets will punish companies. I hope people like this would make their views very well known when fluffy expectations. I was talking about list of greenwash things earlier. When people make claims and then don't live up to them, I hope investors will do their bit. But what we're trying to do with the SDR as well, coming back to one of Rory's comments a moment ago, the SDR is designed to be for consumers. It's not meant to be technical guidance per se for funds. This is about shoring up public trust and having people not rubbishing the sector. And to be able to say, yep, okay, I understand that these parameters that these funds work within, and this is broadly one of these, and this is broadly one of those. And then you know what kind of fund you're looking at. And then it's down to the disclosure to go further. And that, you know, we're going to go forwards, and we will get more and more ambitious over time. But if we start tying people into precise mechanisms and exact measurements of something or other now, I've been doing this a really long time, and that stuff changes over time. So don't hang your hat on something now that, you know, may be completely obsolete in 10 years' time, because something else like, you know, the ISSB has come along and blown it out the water. So there's lots of different levers, lots of different things that all need to come together.
Do you want to pick up, Rory?
I was just
You
going to say, I
did,
think
Mike.
Rory's already answered a
Yes.
really good question, where he said by embedding in their remuneration whether they have a strategy and whether they deliver on it, that is bluntly how a management team and people in a company will have consequences that aren't good for them, at, you know, in a very selfish level in terms of what they get paid. So I think Rory's really hit the nail on the head with that one, particularly in an investor context.
Yeah, you show me the money, show me the behaviour. You you remunerate the right behaviours and metrics for a company to.
What do you think about Julia saying that it can't all be on the consumer, though? And
Well,
this
look,
is a
I
debate,
think,
isn't it, that goes on and on and on. It can't be, can it?
Like
We're in a cost of
decarbonisation
living
is-
crisis.
It's like a middle class utopian dream, isn't it? That, like, you know, a smart thermostat to go on your radiator to make your radiator smart, so you don't have every single radiator on your house. They're 90 quid. Like, you know, a Tesla is not cheap. A heat pump is 30 grand, and you get a 5 grand subsidy. Like, tell someone in Nigeria that. Tell the 5 million people that are in, you know, that are currently in the definition of sort of depravity in the UK because of the cost of living crisis. I mean, it's harder. I always think the consumer is actually the last to go on the journey, and they only go on the journey when it's cost effective enough and whether it's easy enough. And at the moment, to own a Tesla is probably still quite hard work.
But consumers keep being told it's up to them. It so isn't. It's got to be government. It's got to be investors.
But you know, like solar became, and exactly to Mike's point, solar and wind became feasible because it was subsidised, because there was decent regulation and subsidy support to allow it to scale. The same thing's got to happen with hydrogen. The same thing's got to happen with heat pumps. The same thing's got there has got to be that subsidy support. The other thing I just wanted to pick up from what you said is when you try and engage with a company to decarbonise, you know, they don't kick and scream about this stuff, or typically the companies we deal with. They're very supportive, and they don't just see it as a cost item. Like, fine, you want me to replace all my boilers with hydrogen boilers. Do you realise how expensive that is? It's like, they don't actually. They see it as, well, first of all, it's their responsibility. Second of all, they see it as a form of differentiation. So by being net zero aligned, most companies operate somewhere within a supply chain, and at the end of that supply chain will be an Apple or a BMW or a Volkswagen or a Microsoft, and all those guys are probably listed and have their own net zero targets. And in order to supply into those supply chains, you're going to have a net zero target. So we don't look at it as a cost item.
No.
We look at it as an opportunity, and we actually think most businesses that have decent decarbonisation agendas will actually end up benefiting significantly from doing that.
Gabriela.
Innovation is adopted in this. There's a lot of studies that look into that, different technologies, and what was the pattern is the S-shaped adoption curve. Usually you have the more price insensitive users that jump in and buy that Tesla. The first Tesla, the Roadster, was $125,000. Who spends that kind of money in a car, right? And here we are. Well, Model 3 becomes a $30,000 car. There was going to be much, a much bigger share of the population that can afford. So we're going up that cost curve, down that cost curve, and then up on that demand. And that is going to happen with all of these technologies, heat pumps, so on and so forth. But let's take the electric vehicle. We're still talking about the old model where you buy an electric vehicle, much better, bi-directional, even better, so you can use that battery for the benefit of the grid. But it's still the old idea of I buy a car and it's going to sit there idle for 90–95% of the time. That's not a very sustainable idea. Now, bring forward, give us 4 or 5 years. There's a lot of very good companies working very hard on this. Autonomous vehicles. They're going to change completely the way we think about transportation. They're going to be, driving around autonomously, right? No drivers. They'll pick up my kids and take them to their activities, right? And I'm just going to keep monitoring them with my phone. And we're going to be using this electric vehicle that is going to have a bidirectional battery that is going to stop to charge and discharge when it makes economic sense to do so. Artificial intelligence is here to do all of that. That future is 4 or 5 years from now. The use of that car is going to make so much more economic sense that even if I'm price insensitive, I go like, oh my gosh, why am I going to have a car just for me sitting idle 95%, in my driveway? That doesn't make any sense. So we're going towards those solutions, and the adoption, right? It's a dance. You need to have regulators that make all of these technologies. Like, I used to work on renewable energy utility scale investments. I paid $440 or euros per megawatt hour back in 2005 and 6 in the investments that I did in Portugal and in Spain. Now you're underwriting investments, utility scale solar at $30 per megawatt hour, right? We are in that price curve, and that's how we're going to power the last billion. The Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin American users, there's 700 million people on the planet that don't have access to electricity. It's with the same technologies, the same solar panels. It's a very democratic, it's another D of this decentralization and digital and decarbonized grid. It's also very democratic. It is the technologies, it is now what is different about this energy crisis, because we had one in 73, we had one in 79. What is different about this one is that we have alternatives, and we all have the economic incentive to move away. So another comment, Rivian. Rivian, 10% of their shares belongs to Amazon. Amazon is trying to be a good corporate citizen. Part of that is that, but it's also because if you're constantly driving these last mile delivery trucks, maintenance is a really big issue, and the maintenance for an electric vehicle car is significantly lower. They don't break as much. It's not like an internal combustion engine. So it makes economic sense for Amazon to step in and say, I looked through, it's not just the retail sticker price of that truck. It is all in, including insurance, including maintenance and all of that. So it's the economic aspects of these things that I think changes everything. I agree with you. It's an S-shaped curve, is going to happen, but we're going to get to a point somewhat soon, 3 years, 4 years from now, where the incumbent OEM names are no longer going to be bringing to market new internal combustion engine, because nobody will want to buy them. What is the residual value of a car that you buy, which is a pretty material expense for a family? Well, question mark. Look at Norway and what's happening there, where they're already at 75% penetration of electric vehicles. Nobody's buying second-hand internal combustion engine either. So we need to have the right governments doing the right things, consumers buying because it makes economic sense, not necessarily because we're tree huggers. And then we're going to have capital markets being a source of good and capitalism at its best, and we have entrepreneurs, like there's a very long list, and Elon Musk is not the only one, bringing the solutions to market. So that's what I think we need to see more. That's the innovation, the investment, the machine, from venture capital to IPOs to big companies that bring to market what consumers can indeed consume, because it makes economic sense, because they replace with very high user experience, better for your health, better for your lifestyle, but better for your pocket. And that's where I think we are. We are going to see that S-shaped adoption. It's happening in different jurisdictions with different IRA. It's going to get those Californians to move much faster on that adoption of solar panels than us here in the UK. But it's all happening.
So
you summed up beautifully, and I'm going to ask you, Rory, because we're coming to the end of this session, actually. Can we solve that climate crisis?
Look, I'm a climate believer, but I think most of it will happen post 2035, just because of the technological availability of scaled technology that can be readily adopted. And I'll just use a very quick example, because I know we're running out of time. Hydrogen electrolyzers. Like, I am an absolute believer in the use of hydrogen to decarbonize. Not only like carbon-intensive industries that use hydrogen, but lots of other areas. It makes economic sense today to use a green electrolyzer, so that just uses water and electricity, renewable electricity, to produce hydrogen, which goes into things like refining chemicals, etc., etc. There's additional subsidy support on top of that, so it makes absolute economic sense to use a green electrolyzer today. You can't get them. They're a company today, one of the global leaders in manufacturing electrolyzers today, listed on the FTSE, had a massive warning because they cannot manufacture them. They've got the technology, they cannot manufacture them. FTSE 100 company we deal with, it's in equipment rental. We've pushed them for 2 years to decarbonise. They can't. They cannot buy electric equipment. They want to. They can't buy hydrogen-powered equipment. They want to. So we can do everything we can to try and embed scaled technology, but we've got to be realistic about the time frame in which it happens.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to, we mustn't forget about people, and various members of this brilliant panel have brought it up, but you can't just sit there and go, right, everyone's got to do this because I'm really concerned about climate change. And the way that you're going to get people along, and this is referred to as the just transition, is that we can't all stand at the door to the Novotel waiting for someone else to go first. So investors can't wait for the regulators to go first, who are waiting for their investors to be a bit more aggressive, who are waiting for business to innovate, who are waiting for the etc. You've got to just crack on. And I think that it's only in that way whereby good technologies that are really helping us decarbonise do get that subsidy, which means that in the future, 5 to 10 years' time, they become very economic, and therefore we're not having this conversation that we're having now, whereby I'd really love to decarbonise my house, but I can't afford it. That conversation is far likely to be an issue. So we've got to keep going, we've got to stay positive, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, Julia.
And I was going to throw in a point that sort of complements that to a large extent, which is that also we're talking here a lot of the time about people buying new stuff, and it's not something investors, I think, have been necessarily massively involved in, but you know, our electric car is a second-hand Renault Zoe, and it wasn't expensive. It wasn't cheap. There's a lot of people that couldn't afford it, but we're talking about a 10 grand car. So we've got to think that a lot of this is, you know, will trickle down. There'll be ways that people can get access and change. Once it becomes a bit more mature, there'll be things like that, and even, you know, on more basic stuff. So my phone came from back market, again, second hand. You know, there's lots of ways that we can make things, just be a bit more creative and find ways to save money, save the planet at the same time. And if you're so minded, you can, you know, as an individual, maneuver your way around to find a way that you can, if you're, you know, if you're so minded.
Well, that concludes our lunchtime debate, how to solve the climate crisis from an investor's perspective. I think you have. Well done. Thank you to my guests, Mike Appleby, Rory Alexander, Julia Dreblow and Gabriela Herculano, and a huge thanks for all of you for listening to us. I've been your moderator, Nadira Tudor, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.